Welcome to She Said Homestead, the podcast that explores homesteading from a range of perspectives. We're Sage and Mickayla, two homesteaders, each with unique experiences, properties, and future goals for our homesteads. We're discussing various homesteading topics, sharing our personal experiences as women working full-time who are managing homesteads as well, and shining a light on the stories of other inspiring homesteaders.
Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us grow and share these homesteading stories with even more people. Hey there guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mickayla from Calico Cow Acres.
And I'm Sage from Terra Nova Acres, and we both have homesteads in Western North Carolina.
Today we are kind of elaborating on a few of our last several episodes and going a little bit deeper into companion planting. But first, why don't you tell me about your week?
This week, I did taxes. I got poison ivy. What else really fun happened? I think those are the only two bummers. The rest of the week has been pretty good. I signed up for a time to pick up my bees, so I should get them on Friday, right after work. And I checked the forecast, and it's supposed to thunderstorm, like, really hard. So I'm gonna just really trust Chrissy and let her tell me what to do with the bad weather, because apparently we can't just leave them in the package. So that'll be a fun story for next week, one way or another. But I got the sheep back on the pasture, so the sheep and the chickens are both now officially out of the garden and back in their warm weather rotational grazing pattern. And I mulched the garden partially. I think I got like a row and a half done, which doesn't sound like much, but it feels like a lot.
It sounds like you've been doing a lot of stuff this week.
Yeah, and then I worked on putting up part of the fence to fence off the beehives from everybody. Everyone's in their own fence, but inevitably they get out, and I do not need toppled beehives. So extra layer of protection. I got that fence partially up today, and I'll finish it tomorrow, and I'm going to try to film like a hive tour before I get the bees, and then also the process of getting the bees in there. But if it's viciously thunderstorming, I don't know if that's going to happen. It might be a after the chaos update.
You need an umbrella hat so you can hold the camera while you're doing things. Or you can put it on your camera. When it's raining and I want to film, I wrap a Walmart bag around my camera.
I have like a shade structure that I could put up, but I'm just afraid with the wind that inevitably comes with those sorts of storms that it would blow it straight into my electric fence and then would become electrified, and then it would just be a whole other layer of not good. So I don't know if it's a good idea or a terrible idea to put that up.
I'm wondering if it's going to storm here on Friday too now, because it was supposed to rain all weekend or storm all weekend, but Friday wasn't. But we usually get storms right after you do, so maybe it is. Either way, it's supposed to storm all weekend. But I think we are past our frost date officially. I'm not going to put my peppers and tomatoes out, but, well, I mean, they're already out, but they're in a greenhouse.
Yeah, I had that realization yesterday and panic texted you and Chrissy both, and I was like, oh my god, I'm a month behind if the last frost date is already gone, because mine isn't typically until like May 15th, and right now it's the very middle of April, and so I was not planning on this. I know you usually plant out at Mother's Day, so does that genuinely change your plans at all, or are you just going to stick to the same timeline?
So actually our frost date, like our average last frost date, is tomorrow, but we always get a frost in early May, like the first week of May. We did last year, so I'm like nervous to put anything out there and like leave it out there. But yeah, now I feel super behind because I'm like, oh my gosh, I could be planting everything out there right now. My tomatoes just popped up last week, so I thought I was gonna have like 5 more weeks of them growing before they went outside, and now they're just like these teeny tiny little babies. And they're not ready to be planted yet. My peppers, I don't know what's happening with them. That was we've had major windstorms, and we had them in that little greenhouse, and the greenhouse didn't get messed up by the windstorms, but having the door open, literally like multiple shelves worth of tomatoes or pepper trays just like fell off. And so I lost a bunch of peppers. I lost a bunch of labels for peppers. Thankfully, most of the ones I was keeping are okay, but still stressful. Now I don't know what I'm going to do with all of those that I don't have labels for. They're going to be mystery sale peppers, or they're just going to get popped in my orchard. But I think overall, for my sanity, I'm going to just stick with my plan and plant the things when I was planning to plant them. I might, if I can make time for it, I might get a little rebellious, live on the dangerous side of life and plant some like melons and squashes out just to see. But I was already planning to plant zinnias last week, and I haven't done that yet because I just haven't gotten around to it. But I was already planning to live on the wild side with the zinnias, so maybe I'll get a little bit more dangerous and do it with some other stuff too that I have extra seeds of.
Yeah, if you have extra seed, I mean, if you throw 3, 4, 5 in the ground and they end up frosting and dying, then you're just back on the regular schedule and you just gotta pop more seeds in the ground if you happen to spare.
Exactly. That's it. Like, I don't want to do it with a few specific things, and I don't want to plant out my peppers and tomatoes, but I have so many zinnia seeds, I have so many flower seeds, and why not? I might get flowers a month sooner, and that'd be really cool. Are you going to?
My intention is to. Is that going to pan out? Am I going to have the time? That's another question and remains to be seen. I would like to, and I think tonight or tomorrow, I'll try to do a tray each of squash and beans I like to start those in the 1-inch soil blocks, just to give them a little bit of a head start, and then I can see them when I put them in the garden, know where they are, and just see how that goes, because I have plenty of seeds for those. If they die for some reason, that's totally fine. I'll just replant them. But yeah, the potential of getting food a month sooner is really exciting and really enticing.
Very tempting. I just remembered I have one of my 12-foot beds that I'm going to put melons in, that I'm planning to put melons in. And we have our chicks out now. So I might move their tractor onto that bed the next couple days, and then this weekend, maybe I'll plant some melons. Get those going. I've never really started melons or beans or whatever inside, because usually I just plant them outside, but that might be better with the ducks so that they don't immediately annihilate them. I might try that. Who knows what's gonna happen? Who knows what I'll do? Will I make time for it? Also, who knows?
All right, on to today's topic, which is companion planting. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's talk a little bit about why we even do it, or why we even worry about it. So there's two main reasons, one of which we've already talked about in a recent podcast episode, which is companion planting can be a great way to manage pests in your garden without adding synthetic chemicals and things like that. And then the other benefit that we really haven't talked much about yet is there are various symbiotic relationships where either one plant can really benefit another plant, or they can really benefit each other just based on various feedbacks.
Planting certain things together, it can improve the fertility of your soil. It can improve the flavor of certain things. If I'm thinking of like basil and tomatoes. And also, in my opinion, I think companion planting makes your garden look a lot prettier, because it's just, I don't know, it's all mixed together and it adds dimension to it in my mind. And we all know that I like pretty things.
Adding biodiversity to your garden, you're going to be hard pressed to find a situation where that's going to be a negative thing instead of a positive thing.
Some of the common pests that we manage with companion planting dove deeper into this in episode 17, Managing Pests Naturally. So if you want more info on that, go watch that episode. But just a quick list here is aphids, squash bugs, and squash beetles, vine borers, hornworms, deer, rodents like rabbits, squirrels, etc. And I'm going to add cats to that list. Dogs, cats, whatever may be romping through your garden. Do you have anything else? Any others to add to that list?
Not that I can manage with companion planting, no. Chickens don't really care what you plant, they're gonna be in your garden.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. I'm curious to see if it deters any of the ducks. My ducks aren't an issue unless it's baby seedlings. Then they're like, oh my gosh, this looks delicious. The big plants they don't mind. So I'm curious if they stay away from certain things. Companion planting, I don't know that that keeps Ricky away either, but maybe I can figure that out too. I feel like I'll be a genius if that's the case.
And within each of the categories for companion planting, the categories being pest management and symbiotic relationships, there are subcategories within those. So we're going to try to give this information to you in the most organized way so that you can take what you want from it. Under pest management, there are deterrents, there are pest traps, and there are plants that will attract other beneficial insects that tend to be predators of the things that you're trying to get rid of. So we'll start with deterrents. The things that you can put in your garden, these are typically things that smell really strongly, maybe not necessarily to us, sometimes to us, but mostly to insects. And that strong smell tends to keep them away from your plants.
So in the pest management episode, we mentioned marigolds, and I remember we talked about this and said they don't necessarily smell super strong to us, me and Sage, but if you think about being bug-sized, then that, and like burying yourself in a flower or crawling around in the flowers, it makes sense that like the smell of marigolds would be overwhelming. Like I get that. Marigolds are one, and they are pretty much good to pair with whatever you want. They go well with any plant, and you can kind of tuck them into any little nook and cranny in your garden where you've got room.
Another one that's great for pretty much anything is any kind of herb. So herbs are by definition aromatics, which means that they smell strongly, and that's why we like to use them in our food. They have a lot of volatile compounds in them that lend themselves to strong smells and strong taste. So they can pair well with pretty much any plant in your garden, and it's just more food. Whereas something like marigolds, you might not be, harvesting that to eat, but this is just adding something else to your garden that you can pull from to put in your meals.
Another thing that's, I guess, sort of an aromatic is alliums, and those are going to be onions, garlic, any sort of chives, things like that. I have those popped all over my garden right now, literally every single place that I could possibly fit them because I have so many of them, not even for companion planting, just because I needed room for them. But they do act as a really good companion plant too because they repel a lot of bugs, a lot of pests, because they smell strong. So just for an example, they repel carrot flies, and they're good to interplant with any like spring flowering bulbs like hyacinth, tulip, etc. to keep voles and other critters out.
Hot peppers can also be a really good thing to add to your garden, not necessarily because they smell strong, but because pests like squirrels or maybe deer will come across them, taste that really hot pepper, and they will remember it. They will hesitate to chomp down on more plants in that garden space the next time they come in.
Honestly, hot peppers are kind of one that I wish worked on chickens. They're just like, give me more.
Chickens don't have that capsaicin receptor, but I do specifically grow cayenne peppers so that I can give them to my flock as a kind of natural dewormer. If I had a serious worm issue, I would use medication, but it can be good as a preventative course.
Yeah, I know a lot of people add red pepper flakes to their feed to keep critters out of the feed. And a lot of people call that pre-seasoning their chicken, which I think is really funny. Another subcategory of pest management in here is trap crops or plants that are going to attract pests to themselves so that they leave other plants alone. So some examples of this are nasturtium, blue Hubbard squash, and mustard. We kind of chatted about nasturtium and blue Hubbard squash in episode 17, but nasturtium, I think those. You said that you had aphids all over yours. Is that what it was? They really got your
Yes,
aphids.
aphids is what I associate mostly with, what nasturtium is a good trap crop for.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of surprised that I didn't really deal with any aphids at all last year. And then towards the end of the garden season, I looked at my nasturtiums. I was like, oh, that's
Good.
why. I think nasturtium is really pretty, and although it is edible, I tend to not eat it. I think it tastes like hot gasoline. It's just my opinion. And so I leave it there. I look at it, I admire it from a distance, and I never really look close up. And the aphids can be really tiny and really hard to see. So I don't know if I didn't deal with aphids because the nasturtium took care of it for me, or if all of a sudden there was just a burst of them in the fall. But either way, I'll have nasturtium in my garden as a consistent plant.
And then the blue Hubbard squash obviously is going to attract the squash bugs and bugs that are attracted to the squashes. So like vine borers and stuff. I don't know that it necessarily acts as a trap crop for the vine borers and whatnot as much as it does for the actual squash bugs, but I know that it works well for the squash bugs specifically. And those are different things. There are a lot of squash pests. One that we don't have on our list that I thought of earlier today, and I don't think I mentioned this in the pest episode, but this past summer, I noticed on my sunflowers that there were a lot of leaf-footed bugs. And so I'm going to try and plant more sunflowers nearby my tomatoes this year because my tomatoes really suffered from leaf-footed bugs. But I looked into it because I remembered this earlier, and sunflowers are a trap crop, or they're considered a trap crop for leaf-footed bugs, which is very interesting. I don't know if it's certain kinds of sunflowers or just any, but they were on my evening sun sunflowers. So definitely going to do that again.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good to know. I haven't used mustard in my garden as a trap crop, but in doing just a little bit of supplemental research for this episode, I came across some claims that it works really well for harlequin bugs. And then the last subcategory within the pest deterrents is plants that are going to attract beneficial insects into your garden, attract the natural predators to the pests that you're trying to get rid of. A big one in that category is pretty much any kind of flower, but especially things like zinnias, cosmos, borage. Those are really popular with things like predatory wasps, and I don't even know what else. Can you think of any other of those beneficial insects off the top of your head?
I mean, other than just the normal, like the standard pollinators, no. I did notice a lot of the parasitic wasps in our garden last year, and we had a lot of zinnias and cosmos. So I don't know if that's because of that or if they're just kind of around because we have a lot of the flying stingy bee things around here. But yeah, I'm happy about it either way. The second category of companion plants is symbiotic pairings or mutually beneficial combos of plants. So under this category, we have nitrogen fixers, we have pairings that are going to improve flavor, and we have pairings that are going to act as a sort of living mulch. If you have heard about companion planting at all, you've probably heard about this one, and this is planting legumes with your other plants to boost nitrogen in the soil. And legumes are beans, peas, clovers, and things of that sort, where if you leave the plants in the ground, they're going to fix nitrogen in the soil. If you are pulling the plants up, it's unfortunately not going to have that effect or as much of that effect. The plants themselves are still using nitrogen to grow, but when you leave the plant in the ground, it really benefits the soil and adds the nitrogen back into the soil.
Yeah, legumes are pretty cool and are a bigger family of plants that I realized. I don't typically associate like beans and clover in my head. So that's not really something that I would have been aware of otherwise, but they fix nitrogen using nodules on their roots. It's really interesting and I don't fully understand the entire chemical process of it, but even things like peanuts are legumes. And we actually eat the little root nodules in that case. But I have clover all over my pasture, and in some cases, these plants grow where they're beneficial. So clover will naturally grow in nitrogen deficient soil, and then will end up fixing nitrogen and will sort of create an environment where it can be outcompeted eventually by other grasses. There are other plants that will do that, things that have a really big taproot tend to grow in compacted soil and decompact your soil for you. So, in some really cool ways, nature will companion plant for you where you need it.
Another one, I guess this is like technically, it literally says bean, but soybeans are legumes as well. So I noticed last year when I harvested them, I did pull out some of the soybeans because I was trying to plant stuff in their place. You can see if you pull up like some bean plants, soybeans, and some other versions of the legumes, you can see the little nodes all over their roots when you pull the plants up. I don't know about clover, but you can see like little balls all over the roots, and it's interesting. I don't know. I planted a bunch of peanuts last year, and we are going to plant a bunch down in our orchard. I know I've mentioned this before. We're going to plant a bunch in our orchard to act as like part of the fruit tree guilds eventually. So that they just kind of stay in the soil and like do their thing, and they're fixing nitrogen that way. Plus they grow really well here in the South. So I'm curious to see how that works.
The next subcategory is flavor improvement, and I personally am skeptical of this. I spent a decent amount of time trying to figure out a scientific reason that this would be true. And I couldn't find any evidence that I felt like was solid to back up why that would be a phenomenon. Granted, there are a lot of different interactions that we can't see with the naked eye and that might not be completely obvious on the surface. But for example, like you were talking about earlier, it's a really common thing to plant basil with your tomatoes, not just because basil smells strong and might keep some pests away, but because people insist that it changes the flavor. I saw something about volatile compounds from the basil maybe infusing the tomatoes, and I suppose it's possible in theory, but I don't fully buy it. What is your take on this one?
So I can see why people would have that association, because that like they go together in a lot of foods, basil and tomatoes specifically. But in my mind, the way that this works is if I have tomatoes growing in my garden and I'm like going out to pick tomatoes to make a meal out of, and I have basil growing next to it, that is going to make my food taste better than if I were to use the dried basil in my cabinet, if that makes sense. And that's the only reason I like see that making any sense. But honestly, I don't know the science behind that. I don't know if there is science behind that. I like the idea of it, so I'm just gonna roll with it.
Another example that I saw was people claiming that planting borage next to strawberries makes the strawberries sweeter. I've never planted borage. I have planted basil next to my tomatoes before, so I have some experience with that. But I've never planted borage in with my strawberries, so I can't even lend anything to this. But if you want to try it, these are things that people claim. And so you tell us, do you notice a difference?
I started borage the year we moved, and then I never got it planted in the garden because we moved. So I didn't plant any last year. I think I might have seeds for this year. Might go sprinkle some out there in my strawberries now, but I don't know. I don't know if I believe it, but it's a nice thought. The last subcategory under symbiotic pairings that we've gotten here is living mulch. And that's kind of what I was talking about with the peanuts being planted in our fruit tree guilds. That'll be a nice ground cover. And it's because it's low growing and it kind of like sprawls out, but it's not aggressive and it's not going to like fully take over. So when we say living mulch, we mean like low growing plants in general that are just sort of an understory to any sort of taller plants. They're going to keep moisture in your soil. They're going to kind of lower the soil temps when it's really, really hot out in the summer. I know, at least for me, that's a huge deal. It gets really hot here. Like I said, peanuts are an example of that. You could grow clover under wheat. And then there is a very common practice of growing squash around your corn, because I think it's called the Three Sisters method. Is that what that is? Yeah.
Yeah, corn, beans, and squash.
Yeah, so like the beans will climb up your corn stalks and then the squash sprawls out and covers the ground around it, and they kind of all work symbiotically together.
And with living mulch, another added benefit can be that it will choke out and outcompete any other weeds. So if you were to throw hay down or wood chips down as non-living mulch, you're still going to be battling to some extent with weeding. But if you put a plant underneath your fruit trees, or if you put clover underneath your wheat, squash under your corn, it's going to take up that space so that the weeds don't even have a chance to sprout and take away nutrients from the things you're actually trying to grow.
Yeah, and I guess we should probably put a little bit of a disclaimer there that like that's very much going to be based on timing, like when you plant those things too. So if you already have weeds taking over a spot and you try to throw down some seed, it's probably not going to combat weeds like it would if you got that going before the weeds started growing. It's kind of like a cover crop at that point.
And we would be remiss if we didn't also go over some pairings that might not be so beneficial, some pairings to avoid. One reason to avoid specific pairings is because one of the plants is allelopathic. This just means that one of the plants produces some sort of biochemical, typically through its roots, and then pass through the soil, that influence the growth or just general health of other plants. Sometimes this can be, specifically targeted towards another type of plant, or sometimes it can just be general. To give you some context of what on earth that means, biochemicals in soil, that's exactly what caffeine is. Coffee plants developed caffeine to basically be a toxin to any neighboring plants and inhibit their growth. And then humans decided that we need that. And at least I use it every day to get a little jolt, get some more energy. But that's what we're talking about. So some more specific examples of what this actually looks like. Beans and alliums. So alliums, again, being stuff like onion, garlic, chives, those sorts of things. They don't really go together because alliums are allelopathic when it comes to beans. I have totally planted beans next to onions before and nothing terrible happened in the garden. So take all of this with a grain of salt. Both of us break the rules all the time. We're never going to harp on you for stretching the rules or breaking them. But this is just to give you all the information so that you can make the decisions for your garden that you want.
Just to give a very common example, this isn't a garden plant necessarily, but black walnut trees are something that are like highly considered to affect the growth of other plants. So like if you're trying to do an orchard or something, it's very common for people to say, like make sure there aren't any black walnuts because they'll inhibit the growth of other plants around them. So that's, if you've ever heard of that, we're kind of talking about the same thing here with just smaller scale garden style plants instead. I feel like most of the evidence, I don't know, that goes with companion planting is anecdotal. It's like people have tried things for years and like passed down this knowledge of what works for them, what doesn't, and I think you kind of just have to take it all with a grain of salt and try it for yourself. And if something works for you, roll with it. If it doesn't work for you, try something else. And I mean, that's advice I'm going to give you for anything, but companion planting specifically today, like who knows? I don't know. I don't know that there's like tons of evidence behind companion planting in general, but it is very common. It is something you will hear if you are in the homesteading, gardening world in general. So we kind of wanted to just give you these. These are uh, common things to avoid planting together, and if you choose to plant them together and they work out well, let us know. A few more of the allelopathic examples. Brassicas and nightshades are two things that are commonly said not to plant together because brassicas act allelopathic towards nightshades. So they are inhibiting the growth of the nightshades, and nightshades are things like eggplants, tomatoes, peppers.
Apparently, sunflowers are slightly allelopathic towards pretty much anything. It's not like they target a specific plant family. They're just generally allelopathic, and they can tend to stunt the growth of other things. But they're also something that a lot of us gardeners enjoy growing because they typically get really big. They're pretty easy to grow in the grand scheme of things, and they're pretty. And so we put them in our gardens. But just so you're aware, they can have that effect. I always tend to grow stunted peppers, so I can't really say whether that was because of the sunflower or just because I'm in the process of rehabbing my soil in general, and they were already at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have tons of evidence that I've collected on sunflowers, but I had sunflowers mixed all over my garden last year. And I think my issues with my plants were not from the sunflowers. I think they were from weeds and me neglecting my plants. I think I am allelopathic. I inhibit the growth of my plants.
That was funny. That was good.
Another category of plants that we want to avoid planting together are heavy feeders. And that's going to be plants that just kind of take a lot of nutrition from the soil, that they kind of take a lot of the nutrients from the soil. And so if you're planting things together that are both taking a lot of nutrients, they're going to be competing with each other. Things like tomatoes, planting them with corn or planting them with potatoes, that is said to be not a great thing because they all require a lot of nutrients. Again, brassicas and nightshades, not only are the brassicas allelopathic towards the nightshades, they're also both very heavy feeders. And then another example would be squashes and brassicas. A lot of the plants that are going to be giving you lots of fruits and large fruits are going to be heavy feeders. So just, I guess, avoid planting those things together. But again, I'm thinking about this with, we said earlier in this episode, planting squash with corn. Those are both heavy feeders, and we just told you to plant those together. So do what works best for you.
I think specifically in the Three Sisters method, it works to plant the corn and the squash together because you have the beans in there that are in theory fixing that nitrogen. Now, you can get really nitty gritty with it. Well, with, okay, well, if I have 10 corn plants and 2 pumpkins that are squashes, like how many green beans do I need to balance that out? So you can really easily go down the rabbit hole with it. But the best way to learn is just by trying, by doing, by messing it up. The best gardeners have killed the most plants. And different things work for different people. Different things even work for the same person in different spaces. You just never know.
Or different years.
Also true.
With the nitrogen fixers, you just mentioned the Three Sisters method again. The nitrogen fixers, so you're leaving that plant in the ground. So technically, that like the nitrogen fixing that's giving to the soil is going to benefit you the next year or the next time you're planting, not necessarily right away. Like that's the science behind that, and I think that's interesting. I've looked into this recently because I thought that was really weird. I was like, well, you have to leave the plant in the ground, so you're not getting the benefits technically until the following season or whenever you're planting in it next. Once that like has released the nitrogen back into the soil.
We want to make this information available to you, but also, particularly if you're a new gardener, something that I want to avoid is making anyone feel overwhelmed. These are building blocks for you to add on as you're ready to do that. Some of you might be really eager and really interested and down to try, a bunch of these, and some of you might get really overwhelmed at the thought of, oh my goodness, how do I plant my garden so that this and this are next to each other, but not this? And especially in a tiny space where it's like, how far away do they have to be to not interact with each other? This is all best case scenarios. This is, building in efficiencies. This is not going to make or break your garden, and I don't want to portray it as such.
I remember getting super worried and stressed out the first year or two that I was trying to garden on like a scale with more than one small bed or pots with crop rotation. Like making sure that I'm putting different things in different beds each following year, and that really overwhelmed me at first. So I can see like the same thing happening with companion planting. And I've never been in one place more than 1 year at this point, but I've kind of like come to the mental space where I'm like, okay, I don't think I'm actually going to follow that, and I think it's going to be okay. So, if you are overwhelmed, just like do what you can manage doing and what you can take on mentally. Don't let it overwhelm you, and it's all going to be okay. It's going to be fine. Like you might kill some plants, and that's fine. I kill plants all the time. You're not going to avoid that. So accept that, move on, and just roll with it. Okay, do you want to go over some specific examples of companion planting in our gardens?
Yeah, so I try to do a decent amount of companion planting, and honestly, the first year that I was here, I really didn't worry about it because it was my first year growing on this sort of scale, and I was overwhelmed. So I said, you know what? I'm not going to mess with it. I'm going to focus on planting on this new scale at this new volume, learn from that, and then my second year, I might worry about it. And that's exactly what happened. The first year, I planted my stuff out. My soil was terrible. Bugs killed a lot of my plants, and a lot of them did really poorly just because they didn't have the nutrients in the microbiome that they needed to thrive. Totally fine. Last year, I really wanted to protect my tomatoes. So I basically threw all of the companion plants that I could think at my tomatoes. I planted basil in a row right next to like the feet of my tomato plants. And I did that with marigolds as well. So it was kind of in a checkered pattern. I would do basil, marigold, basil, marigold, basil, marigold along my entire row of tomatoes. And then right next to that, I did all of my different kinds of herbs that I planted. So I had rosemary, lavender, oregano, thyme. Those were my main herbs that I put right next to there. And then I also interplanted some melons, some squash family things with my tomatoes so that I would interrupt the tomato pests so they couldn't just decimate a whole row. And what I found was that the marigolds worked really, really well. The basil worked really, really well. And I do think that the herbs helped a lot. I don't think that the melons, I don't think the squash family things did much, if anything, but I didn't have a ton of pests on my tomatoes. I found a few mummified hornworms, which was really cool to see. But honestly, I got really lucky with my tomatoes last year. I don't remember getting any blight. The only thing was that I didn't start them inside, I would say early enough, which I didn't think was going to be a big deal. And then, particularly, my Romas got stunted because the days started to get shorter. They realized that time is running out, and they just got, I don't know, like 2.5, 3 feet tall max. And I had this whole huge trellis for them. So really, I was the biggest bummer for my tomatoes last year. No surprise there.
I think for me, last year specifically, I kind of was in the same spot you were the first year, where you were just trying not to worry about that too much the first year. This year I'm thinking about it a little bit more, but last year we did peanuts around our okra plants, and I did have artichokes, but they ended up getting drowned because we had some flooding. Uh, so they were around those as like a ground cover. And then we have strawberries around our asparagus, which is also a really common pairing that acts as a ground cover. And they complement each other well. I have calendula in my garden, nasturtiums popped in all the corners. I do marigolds just like you do with the basil in my tomatoes. Last year I did a lot of zinnias at the ends of my shorter beds, but this year we're putting our tomatoes in a different spot because I just didn't like where they were last year. So they're all on 17-foot long beds. And I think I'm going to try and put zinnias mixed into them a little bit more than just on the ends, since the rows are so long, to attract more of the pollinators and whatnot to them. And also I just think it'll look pretty. And then I guess I don't really care if the sunflowers are going to try and stunt my stuff. I think I might try and mix sunflowers in as well to act as trap crops, because they worked so well, but they were off to the side last year. And so I just don't think I had enough of them, one, and I don't think that they were in close enough proximity to my tomatoes to assist with the leaf-footed bugs that were on those. And then I think I'm going to try the blue Hubbard squash too, again. None of my squash did well last year, and that's, again, a me thing because I didn't water them. And then a squash bug thing after that, because they were like, okay, well, these plants are sad anyway, let's just eat them. So I'll try that again. We'll see if it works for me this year. I think that's probably it. I guess I have herbs all over the place. So, and then I have onions and leeks all over my garden this year.
I did try to use onions as a companion plant last year, but my fatal flaw in doing that was that I planted them too close to the edge of the bed, and they were outcompeted by the grass. So I'm not making that same mistake this year. I'm just going to let onions be onions and not try to use them as a companion plant. I have plenty of other things to use. But another thing that I really enjoy, both aesthetically and because I feel like it works, is putting flowers throughout. Something that I really struggle with is keeping track of separate varieties, whether that's, I tend to put my varieties of tomatoes all together, and then I'll mix up my Semmarzanos and my Romas. I'll be like, oh no, where does it end? So flowers can be a really good marker for me to separate my tomato varieties or pepper varieties or whatever, where I have several that are one, and I want to know that they're the same, and then I want to know that this next to it is different because maybe it's a really spicy pepper versus a really sweet pepper or something like that. So that's really helpful for me in a lot of different ways. And I think the flowers are one of the main things that brought in those parasitic wasps that ended up taking care of my hornworms for me. Yeah. So I will absolutely be doing that again. I personally think that the zinnias and the cosmos did that the most. I do also keep, dill kind of sprinkled around, mostly next to my squash. That's just an association I have in my head. That's it's not based on scientific research or anything. I don't know how well that does or doesn't work, but I know that it doesn't hurt, and so I keep doing it. I'm not really a dill person, but it's another flower and it's another thing that pollinators can use, so I'm not going to complain about it. And then, of course, nasturtium, like we were talking about earlier, I planted a bunch of those also around my tomatoes. Surprise, surprise. Those, like I said earlier, I don't really eat them. They are just an aesthetic thing for me and a trap crop for me. I think they work really well specifically for aphids. And so I actually, now that I'm thinking about it, might need to go throw some nasturtium in the bed where I have my lettuce and my spinach right now, because I know that aphids are probably going to get interested in those sooner than later.
I was just thinking the same exact thing. Also, I think moral of the story here is put everything, every defense you can around your tomatoes. That's the moral of the story for this entire episode. Pull out all the stops for your tomatoes because they need the help. You've said zinnias, you've said basil, marigolds, cosmos. I have oregano and thyme planted, nasturtiums, all of the things for the tomatoes.
Yeah, for me, tomatoes were something that I was really bummed out that I didn't get more of my first year gardening. And so that's why I went a little companion planting crazy around my tomatoes. But I also have probably half of my tomato stash left. Like, I have so many tomatoes from last year. And I even had so many that I was doing things like just putting them in a pot and boiling them down to make tomato paste, because I didn't want to go through the effort of canning them. I was like, just get this reduced to the smallest package possible and then I'll freeze it. Like, I almost had too many tomatoes last year. So I think this year I might dial it back a little bit on the tomato companion planting and direct more of that towards the squashes and pumpkins, because I also struggle with those. Those can be pretty fragile for me. I honestly think I will always struggle with those. I don't think I will ever out companion plant the pests for that family of plants, just because there's so many here where I live in the South. I think the vine borers are always going to kill most of my squash plants, and it's just going to be a matter of how much I can delay them and how much fruit I can get off of those plants before they do inevitably die. So it's never going to be a perfect world for my garden.
I'm very curious to see what happens with mine this year. If I actually manage to take care of them well, I am really, really hoping the ducks help with that. If they do, I will forgive all of the duck woes we've dealt with just for squash. I was gonna ask, you said you have a lot of tomatoes left over. How's your squash situation? Your pumpkin / squash? Are they gone?
So I wasn't good about preserving squash last year. I prioritized getting things like tomatoes and green beans because I really wanted to have stuff like that, and squash was just the lowest on the totem pole, and I did not have enough time / energy / executive functioning to get to it. So if I had gotten to preserving all of the extras that I had, yeah, I would still be eating on squash, but I didn't, so I'm not.
Well, I think we got so little squash that we just like immediately ate it as soon as it was ready. Like, I was picking it to make zucchini fritters and summer squash and whatnot immediately, because I was like, if I don't pick this now, it's gonna be like gone by tomorrow because of these dang bugs. So hopefully next year we'll get more. This year.
I will say that I do still have butternut squashes. I forget about those. Butternut squashes are something that is typically more resistant to things like vine borers than most of the other squash varieties, especially winter squash. Winter squash takes longer to mature than summer squash, so it's more of a battle. And I threw some butternut squash plants, I think it was 18 plants, on a slope where I had been pulling basically rotted horse manure. And it was very destabilized soil because I had been moving it. It's a really nutrient-rich soil, so I knew that the heavy feeder that squash is would love it. And so I just threw them over there and forgot about them, and then harvested like 40 or 50 pounds of butternut squash off of it. So I do have a lot of that, and I did not companion plant next to that. It was in a new area, so that could have given them an advantage. And then they are supposed to be naturally a little bit more resistant, which would, you would hope, give them an advantage. So I do still have a lot of that. That's not thanks to companion planting in that particular instance. We have put together a free PDF for you guys. The link to download that is down in the description below if you want to check that out. We have been putting together those PDFs for just additional reference for you all in multiple episodes, especially the more informative ones. So I know we have a no-dig, no-till PDF resource for you. We did some PDFs for the cost breakdown of raising chickens and then seed starting. What are some of the other ones that we have, Mickayla?
We just put one out on the ideal garden for beginners. We're going to have one for this episode that goes together with the pest management episode.
Those are available on our Instagram highlights. Those are in the description of the episodes that they're meant to go along with. And if you're looking for a free resource to go along with all this information that we talk at you about for an hour, those are really great. And again, totally free.
Maybe someday we'll have a landing page where you can find all of them. For now, that's going to be Instagram. If there are any topics that you want to hear about, you want us to make those free PDFs for, make sure to comment or send us a message and let us know so that we can do an episode on that for you. Thanks for joining us on this episode of She Said Homestead. We hope you enjoyed our chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Send your homesteading stories to us at shesaidhomestead@gmail.com. We can't wait to share them on the air. To stay connected, follow us on Instagram for updates and sneak peeks at what's coming up next.
If you like video podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the She Said Homestead YouTube channel too. We can't thank you enough for being part of the She Said Homestead community. Until next time, happy homesteading.